A very important issue with surveys and experiments and simulations is bias. Now, the word bias, if it's used in common speech, usually has a negative connotation. Bias in terms of statistics just means that there's some shift that's happened, that your sample is somehow systematically different than the population. Here's a nice normal curve representing the distribution of your population. When we talk about bias, we're talking about the systematic shift. Something maybe like this, right? This is your sample. Now, the mean of your sample is really quite different than the mean of the population. So there's some bias that might have happened, and it could be either above or below. It doesn't make too much difference. That's what we really mean by bias. There are a variety of sources of bias, and we're going to cover a number of them in this video. Let's look at an example. Here's a national survey which uses a simple random sample drawn from all known households across the country. Seems pretty complete. But there's actually a bias, which is called undercoverage bias. Who is not being covered by this survey? The homeless, students living in dorms, prison inmates. In the design of the survey, are they trying to get to these populations? If not, then there might be undercoverage bias. So there might be, the students living in the dorms, there might be something in common that they all have, which would end up being a lurking variable. And if you have a lurking variable, then you might have bias. There's actually another group which might not be contained in this survey. Unknown households. Really? Does the government or whoever is conducting this have a complete list of all households in the entire country? Even the ones that, maybe were purchased within the last 6 months? Probably not. So when you're dealing with a very large population, there's always going to be unknowns to any list that you have. The next type of bias is called the non-response bias. This is when individuals selected to be part of the sample either can't be contacted or refuse to cooperate. This can be a real problem. Non-response can be due to a lurking variable. So it's really hard to overcome that, actually, because if the lurking variable causes people to not respond, you can't get other people to fill in for them because they wouldn't respond for the same lurking variable. So you would have a systematic shift or a bias due to that. And if non-response bias wasn't bad enough, we can actually have response bias. Well, this can take many forms. This is when individuals, either intentionally or unintentionally, respond inaccurately. It's entirely possible that respondents might simply lie, especially if the survey is about something sensitive, potentially illegal, socially unacceptable. If we're surveying people about the use of illegal drugs, some people may just lie about it and simply not respond truthfully. The attitude of the interviewer can have a very large impact on the response of the one being surveyed. And this can be, a roll of the eyes or a tone of the voice. It could also be body language. It could be the age of the interviewer, the race of the interviewer. All these things can be subtle but important ways of introducing bias, and difficult to get over because sometimes you need interviewers and you can't get away from having people of a certain age sometimes. So you just have to be aware. If a survey is asking about past events, well, maybe people have faulty memories. We all do to some degree, actually. We will remember past events sometimes a little differently than they actually happened. How the questions are worded can be very important and introduce bias. If they're confusing, they'll really skew results. How a survey form is physically designed, its layout, can actually affect its outcome. Some rather famous studies done about election ballots in the United States. Different states can design their ballots different ways, and some of them are more confusing than others and introduce significant bias sometimes. So these are, some of the ways that bias can be introduced. You can often really not get away from them completely. You can never actually get away from them completely. But don't be too doom and gloom, right? Surveys are actually pretty useful. We can get some pretty good information if we keep all this in mind and design it well, because we need to get data somehow. And again, the solution that is used by statisticians to deal with this is randomization. As long as you keep things randomized, then what bias there is will get balanced out, and there won't be a systematic shift. That's all we can really hope for.